what led to the resurgence of the new right and conservatism. Okay, so as far as that goes, let me go ahead and note that. All right, let me go ahead and go into my document that I shared earlier. I'm going to give another link to that document, and let's go ahead and get into this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I want to talk about some of the things that are leading to that. Like, how do we go from the landslide? Okay, how do we go from the landslide defeat of Barry Goldwater in 1864 to a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan in 1980. So the 1960s, okay, the 1960s are the high water mark of so-called American liberalism. Okay, so when we think about American liberalism, where you're thinking about in terms of a more involved government with the ability to regulate business and the economy, government as an agent for creating a more equal society with social welfare programs, affirmative action, government that should take actions to integrate schools, you know, where you have the white flight to suburbs is answered by forced busing, that sort of thing. So this is what's going on in the 60s. Now in the 70s, there's something that we call the credibility gap. Okay, so Vietnam, for example, remember that before Vietnam, right before the Vietnam War, I mean, really at the beginning, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave President Johnson carte blanche, like we trust President Johnson to deal with this. And then, of course, President Johnson ends up getting us involved in this war that just ended up being a quagmire. Now, some of y'all are asking for some synthesis comparisons or whatever. That's something you could very well compare to George W. Bush and the war in Iraq, that after 9/11, everybody was like, hey, we trust the president. We trust George W. Bush. I mean, it was seen as unpatriotic not to trust the president. I mean, those of you taking the exam, y'all were, you know, some of y'all weren't even alive at that time. So as far as that goes, I mean, some of y'all weren't even alive, but there was a period between 2001 and 2003. I mean, 2002, George W. Bush was one of the most popular presidents of all time. And people are like, I support the president. And not to support the president seems unpatriotic. Then he got us involved in the war in Iraq, which turned into a major quagmire. And there was a bit of a credibility gap there. So Vietnam, then Watergate. Now we include the Ford pardon, which, of course, looking back, the Ford pardon was not necessarily something, I mean, I don't think there was really a corrupt bargain there. I think I think there's a credible argument to say that Gerald Ford was doing the right thing, that the country did not need to go through seeing an ex-president prosecuted. It's like, look, he's not president anymore. Let this thing be over. But of course, a lot of people, when Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, they saw a corrupt bargain. And then to add to everything else, a bad economy. Okay, so what we see here is that Americans, while in the 1960s, it was like, you know what, maybe we kind of like government, okay, and we can let government do a little more. But when we see some of these things happen, that the economy is going bad, that there's a credibility gap, you know, people are thinking, you know what, maybe I don't trust government so much anymore. Now, Barry Goldwater was somebody who was ahead of his time, because he's coming around at a time when Americans seem to be, the majority of Americans seem to be ready for government to do a little bit more than it had been doing. Now, then you get into the OPEC oil embargo, okay, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And so we see that OPEC, you know, because the United States was supporting Israel, they're like, we're just going to we're going to put an embargo. Oh, this cursed don't grab me. Remember that with Jefferson? So OPEC stops exporting oil in response to the U.S. support for Israel, and gas prices increase. There's scarcity, rationing, all of that. And then we start to see inflation, okay? So hyperinflation, which is partly a result of what you're seeing under Lyndon Johnson, is Lyndon Johnson, on one hand, wanted to fight the war in Vietnam, which cost money, and then he wanted to fight a war on poverty. And so as far as this goes, this creates budget deficits, and the economy in the 1970s, you had bad inflation. Now, Gerald Ford, this is one of the funniest things in the world, that with inflation now, Gerald Ford, he decided to declare inflation Public enemy number one. Okay. And so he made these buttons. It was called Win, Whip Inflation Now. And so you could get a button. There was a gym bag, there's the button again. There we go with some more buttons. There's a Win football. There's a Win sweater, Whip Inflation Now. And so a Win watch. And so the thing is, gosh, that one, but Whip Inflation Now. And the thing is, it didn't work. So there's Gerald Ford, like inflation is public enemy number one. Whip inflation now, because we can't afford to lose. Ah, ha, 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 ha. All right. But anyway, this is something that it's just another thing where government's like, hey, we're going to fix it, and it doesn't get fixed. Okay, so people's trust in government is going to a low. Now, the misery index, this is something that you heard Republicans refer to a lot, that you take inflation plus unemployment and you put them together. Okay, you put these two numbers together and see what you get. Now, as far as the misery index, okay, so when we look at the misery index, we see that with Harry Truman, we're looking at a 7% misery index. Now, with Nixon, 10%. With Ford and Carter, we're getting to 16%. Okay, so the misery index is at 16, where you see with Reagan it goes down, then with H.W. Bush, and then ever since then we've never seen it. We've seen it in the single digits. Okay, by and large, as far as the average of their presidencies. And so with that, when you look at the 1970s, the misery index was at its all-time high ever since, at least for post-war. And so as far as that goes, we see that, people are not having faith in the government's ability to manage the economy. Then the Iran hostage crisis, okay, which this is something here that Jimmy Carter had a humanitarian foreign policy. It was a lot like Woodrow Wilson. And what happened here is that, 66 Americans were taken hostage for over a year. And so Jimmy Carter ordered a rescue mission. That was botched, okay? He can't even rescue our hostages. And so basically people are thinking that government is, too intrusive and inept, unable to tackle the problems. Like government made these promises and it's not able to keep them. So as far as that goes, we see here that the economy's bad. Our foreign policy is seen as weak. Now, remember, in the 1970s, between Nixon and Carter, so Nixon, Ford, and Carter all adhered to this policy of detente, trying to basically have a peaceful relationship with the communist world. And so the thing is, we start to see conservatives mobilize. Now, Nixon, like I said, we wouldn't necessarily call Nixon a conservative, but Nixon definitely courted conservatives when he talked about the silent majority, okay, which you hear President Trump use this term sometimes, the silent majority. Now, this is to say that this is a time when you had all the hippies and all these people protesting, and Nixon says that I am speaking to you tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans. And so you see here that you start to see the rise of conservative interest groups. Now, two of these that you want to note here is that we've got the Eagle Forum with Phyllis Schlafly. Now, the Eagle Forum was very, very important in the sense of defeating the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, where Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum and these conservative women, they're like, look, I mean, I don't want the Equal Rights Amendment. I don't want to be drafted. I mean, if you think about it, usually when I'm teaching, I'll ask the young women in my class, how many of you would like to be eligible for the draft? Now, if you ask women, how many of you would like equal rights? Everybody's hand shoots up. You ask the specific question, how many of you want to be eligible for the draft? Very few hands come up. And so Phyllis Schlafly and these conservative women used arguments like this to defeat the ERA. Now, then with Jerry Falwell, there's the moral majority. And the so-called religious right. So basically what's happening here, now this was not a part of Goldwater's coalition. Now, if we want to think about why did Goldwater lose and why did Reagan win, Goldwater actually later in his life wrote, was very critical of the religious right. He was not a big fan. But the thing is that Reagan was able to incorporate the religious right into the conservative movement and to really capitalize on that when it came to votes, because that force really had not been mobilized in the 1960s. And so, as I said earlier, that you've got fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, and security conservatives, okay? And so Reagan is promising, I'm going to cut government programs and spending, I'm going to cut taxes, I'm going to be anti-abortion, I'm going to champion traditional family values, and I'm going to have a strong military and aggressive foreign policy, okay? So those are the things that Ronald Reagan is looking at here. And so as far as that goes, you see in 1980, Reagan is elected when Goldwater was not, okay? And again, Reagan and Jefferson, both were advocates of limited government. Both described their victories as revolutions. Both were only partially successful in achieving their goals of smaller government. Now, as far as that as well, and when we think about, Reagan and the military, okay, so when it came down to it, let me see, let me go ahead and let's see, let me insert, all right, row below, all right, let me run in here, and because, the exam, I think I may have made this before we had this redesigned exam, because remember, anytime we're comparing, we want to make sure that, we want to make sure that we are having we're comparing similarities and differences. Okay. So as far as that goes, Jefferson, okay. So Jefferson cut military spending. Okay. So military spending. Reagan increased military spending. And let me just, let me go just regular 12 point there. All right. So Reagan increased military spending. Okay. So, Jefferson, okay. Jefferson was really, not, was less likely, to invoke religion, than his predecessors. Okay. Whereas Reagan openly courted the religious conservatives. Okay. So when we think about that, anytime that we're looking at comparing, remember that we want to note similarities and differences. Okay. We want to note similarities and differences. And so those are a few things that I would note there. But yes, achieving their goals, smaller government, and had trouble and had trouble with, and let's see, smaller government and reforming the judiciary. Okay. So those are some things there, some comparisons between Reagan and Jefferson. And as I'd said earlier, Reaganomics. Okay. So tax cuts and all of that kind of stuff. They're a lot like the 1920s. Now, what they call supply side economics. All right. Supply side economics. So going with that. All right. So those are some things here that I think we've put into that. Let's see here.